standing in the center of the town square. Ruth Callahan watched as the neighbors she had fed for 40 years cheered her public ruin. Her hands were zip-tied behind her back, and the heavy iron skillet she'd used to defend her diner lay in the dirt, tagged as evidence of a crime she didn't commit. The Heritage Walk ledgers, the proof of a toxic conspiracy she'd risked everything to uncover, had just been outed as forgeries planted to frame her for industrial espionage. As the police cruiser's door hung open, the mayor leaned in close, his voice a low, oily whisper over the roar of the Founders' Day crowd. The town doesn't want the truth, Ruth. They want the mall, and you're just the crazy woman who tried to burn it down. The siren's blue light pulsed against the brick walls of her family's legacy, illuminating the one person she couldn't look at. Her own nephew, Daniel, standing behind the mayor with a signed confession in his hand. One name kept echoing in her mind, a name she'd found scrawled on the back of the real land deed just before the locks were changed. A name that changed everything about who was actually pulling the strings in Monticello. She had 48 hours before the first bulldozers hit the toxic soil, no allies left, and a prison sentence waiting for her. The only thing she had left was a secret hidden in a 1920s floor safe that the city didn't know existed, and a desperate realization. The enemy wasn't the man in the suit, but the person she had trusted most. The bristle brush snagged on a dried clump of something dark near the storm drain. Ruth pressed harder, water from the bucket sloshing over her sneakers. The air hung thick with the scent of motor oil and wet concrete, the kind of smell that clung to the back of her throat. Somewhere down the block, a car door slammed. She didn't look up. Her knuckles, swollen from decades of wrestling with rusted bolts and heavy cast-iron skillets, burned against the rough pavement. 4 in the morning in Monticello was usually a time of heavy, humid silence, broken only by the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the distant, mournful whistle of the freight train passing through the valley. Today, the silence felt fractured. The dark smear on the concrete resisted her efforts, a stubborn reminder of the scuffle that had broken out near the diner's entrance just hours before. She dunked the brush back into the bucket, the water swirling with gray silt and a faint, pinkish tint. The official's shoes appeared first, polished black Oxfords, the kind that never touched real dirt. Then the crease in his slacks, sharp enough to cut. Ruth wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a smear of pink-tinged water across her skin. The man cleared his throat, a dry, academic sound that set her teeth on edge. "Miss Callahan?" She set the brush down, her knees popping like dry kindling as she stood. The water in the bucket had turned the color of weak tea. "You're early." He didn't smile. "This isn't a social call." His fingers tapped the envelope against his palm, once, twice, like he was counting seconds. The paper made a dry, whispering sound. He looked past her at the diner, the faded red brick, the flickering neon sign that had been the heartbeat of this corner since her grandfather opened the doors in 1928. There was a predatory stillness in his eyes, the look of a man who saw a ledger instead of a legacy. Ruth reached for the rag draped over the bucket's rim. The fabric was rough, the kind that left red lines on her hands if she scrubbed too long. She wiped her palms slowly, watching the way his Adam's apple bobbed when he swallowed. "You gonna hand that over? Or are you just here to practice your stance?" The envelope landed on the concrete between them. It didn't flutter. The official's voice dropped, like he was sharing a secret he found distasteful. "You've got until Friday." A siren wailed in the distance, then cut off abruptly. Ruth bent to pick up the notice, the movement stiff. The paper was heavier than it looked, embossed with the official seal of the city of Monticello. It felt cold against her calloused fingers. "Friday's my daughter's birthday." His shoes shifted, grinding a bit of grit into the sidewalk she'd just cleaned. "I'm sorry to hear that." She folded the envelope in half, then in half again, the edges pressing into her skin. The official turned to leave, his soles clicking against the pavement with a finality that echoed off the brick walls. Ruth waited until he reached the curb before she spoke. "You ever wonder what happens to the people you kick out?" He didn't answer. The car door shut with a final, hollow sound, and the black sedan pulled away, leaving a faint cloud of exhaust that hung in the stagnant air. Ruth stood alone on the sidewalk, the eviction notice a lead weight in her pocket. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, a bruised purple light that revealed the true state of the town, the boarded-up windows of the hardware store across the street, the weeds choking the gutters. She knew then that the city council hadn't just been talking about urban renewal in their hushed meetings. They had already sold the dirt beneath her boots. They had sold the history of her family to a group of men who wore suits like armor and viewed Monticello as nothing more than a site for a luxury complex called Heritage Walk. By 6 o'clock, the familiar chime of the bell above the diner door began its morning song. The smell of frying bacon and bitter coffee filled the air, a temporary barricade against the outside world. Ruth moved with a practiced, economical grace, sliding plates of eggs and grits onto the counter. Her eyes, however, stayed on the door. She'd propped a clipboard next to the register, the words, "Petition Against Condemnation," scrawled across the top in her thick, blunt handwriting. "Sign it, Silas," she said, sliding a mug of black coffee toward a man who looked like he'd been pressed between the pages of an old ledger. Silas Whitmore, 78 and built of sharp angles and secrets, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He'd spent 40 years as a city clerk, and he knew the smell of municipal rot better than anyone. He didn't reach for the pen. Instead, his watery blue eyes scanned the room, lingering on the two men in the back booth, strangers in expensive denim who hadn't touched their omelets. "Ruth," Silas whispered, his voice a dry rustle, "you're kicking a hornet's nest with a bare foot." "The nest is already in my kitchen, Silas. Might as well see who's inside." She tapped the clipboard. "They say the foundation is a hazard. My grandfather poured that concrete with his own hands. It'll outlast the mayor, and it'll damn sure outlast you." Silas cleared his throat, a nervous habit that made his Adam's apple jump. He leaned over the counter, the scent of mothballs and old paper clinging to his suit. "The council didn't just vote on the complex, Ruth. They finalized the sale of the entire block 3 weeks ago. Private session, no minutes recorded." Ruth's hand tightened around the handle of the coffee pot. "Closed doors. That's how they do it now?" "It's how they do it when the buyer is paying for the privilege of silence," Silas said. He reached into his tattered briefcase and pulled out a heavy, manila envelope, sliding it across the Formica counter with a trembling hand. "I found this in the old archives. It shouldn't exist." Before Ruth could reach for it, the bell above the door jangled violently. The two men from the back booth were no longer sitting. They moved with a synchronized, predatory intent, their shadows stretching long across the checkered floor. One was broad-shouldered with a jagged scar through his eyebrow. The other was leaner, his eyes hidden behind dark lenses. "Miss Callahan," the scarred one said, his voice a low growl that silenced the morning chatter of the regulars. "We'll take that envelope. It's city property." Ruth didn't flinch. She stepped back, her hand disappearing beneath the counter to find the familiar weight of her 12-inch cast-iron skillet. "This is a place of business. If you aren't ordering the blue plate special, you're trespassing." "Don't make this difficult," the lean one said, reaching for the envelope. Ruth moved faster than a woman her age was supposed to. She swung the skillet in a short, brutal arc. The heavy iron connected with the scarred man's ribs with a sickening thud. He wheezed, the air leaving his lungs in a sharp gasp as he stumbled back into a table, sending coffee mugs shattering to the floor. The lean man lunged, his fingers clawing at Ruth's flannel sleeve. But Silas, fragile, ancient Silas, tripped him with a well-placed cane. "Get out!" Ruth barked, her voice echoing like a gunshot in the small space. She raised the skillet again, the seasoned iron gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Get out before I decide you look like a side of hash browns." The intruders retreated, the scarred one clutching his side, his face pale with shock. They vanished into the morning fog that still clung to the street, leaving the diner in a stunned, ringing silence. Ruth didn't wait for her heart to slow down. She grabbed the envelope and ushered Silas into the kitchen, the swinging door thudding shut behind them. With trembling fingers, she tore the seal. Inside was a map, but not the glossy, sanitized version the mayor had shown on the local news. This one was detailed, technical, and covered in red-inked zones that didn't match the retail and residential labels. Her eyes darted over the legends, her mechanical mind trying to process the scale of the destruction. But it wasn't the map that broke her composure. It was the signature on the preliminary land transfer stapled to the back. The primary witness signature was bold, looping, and painfully familiar. Daniel Callahan. The name felt like a physical blow to her solar plexus. She leaned against the stainless steel prep table, the cold metal seeping through her shirt. Daniel. Her nephew. The boy she'd raised after her brother wrapped his truck around a telephone pole. She'd sent him to college in Atlanta, or so she thought. She'd scraped together every spare cent from double shifts and weekend repairs to give him a life that didn't involve grease under his fingernails. "He's in college, Silas," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He's supposed to be in class." Silas looked away, his gaze fixed on a stack of clean plates. "He's been back in town for months, Ruth, working for the Heritage Group. They call him a community liaison. I think they just wanted someone with your name to sign the papers so it looked like the family was on board." Betrayal had a taste. Bitter, like burnt coffee in copper. Ruth folded the paper, her jaw tightening until the muscles twitched. Her own blood was the one holding the pen while they signed away her life. She realized then that this wasn't just a corporate land grab. It was a calculated, personal execution. The next morning, the sun rose over a town that felt like a stranger. Ruth didn't open the diner. She didn't brew the coffee. Instead, she put on her best flannel, the one without the oil stains, and drove to the city council office. The building was a squat, beige brick monstrosity that smelled of floor wax and stagnant air. "I need to see Mayor Vance," she told the receptionist, a young woman who looked like she'd been coached to be as unhelpful as possible. "The mayor is in meetings all day, Miss Callahan. You can leave a message. Tell him Ruth Callahan is standing in his lobby. Tell him I've got a map he might be interested in." The receptionist didn't blink. 2 security guards appeared from the hallway, their faces as blank as the walls. They didn't speak. They simply took her by the arms and marched her toward the exit. Ruth didn't struggle. She knew the value of energy. As the heavy glass doors shut behind her, she saw the mayor's reflection in the glass, watching from a second-story window. He didn't wave. He just pulled the blinds. When she got back to the diner, a man in a tan windbreaker was waiting by the door. He handed her a bright orange sheet of paper. "Emergency condemnation order. Hazardous foundation," the man said, not looking her in the eye. "You've got 48 hours to clear out your personals. Demolition is scheduled for Monday morning. Ruth didn't scream. She didn't cry. She went to the back door, intending to lock herself in and think, but the wood was splintered around the frame. The door swung open with a mournful creak. Inside, the sanctuary of her life had been desecrated. Tables were overturned, the jukebox was smashed, and her grandfather's photos had been ripped from the walls. They hadn't taken the money from the register. They were looking for the envelope. She reached for the wall phone to call Silas, but the cord hung limp, the copper wires sliced clean. The isolation was deliberate. They wanted her quiet, and they wanted her scared. She stepped back out onto the sidewalk, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Across the street, the black sedan was back. It sat idling, the tinted windows reflecting the gray sky. It was a predator waiting for the prey to bolt. Ruth bolted. She climbed into her old Ford F-150, the engine groaning to life with a familiar, comforting rumble. She needed to get to Silas's house on the outskirts of town. He was the only one who knew the truth, the only one who could help her make sense of the map. As she pulled away from the curb, the sedan followed, a dark shadow in her rearview mirror. The chase began in earnest as she hit the long stretch of road leading toward the Old Creek Bridge. The sedan didn't try to hide anymore. It surged forward, the grille of the heavy car looming in her mirror. Thud. The first impact sent her head snapping back. The truck fishtailed, the tires screaming against the asphalt. "You want to fight?" Ruth muttered, her knuckles white on the wheel. "I'll give you a fight." The bridge appeared ahead, a rusted iron span that was barely wide enough for two cars. The sedan rammed her again, harder this time, trying to nudge the rear of the truck toward the low railing. Below, the creek was a dark, swirling mess of red clay and debris. Ruth didn't brake. She waited until the very last second, then jerked the wheel toward a narrow, overgrown logging trail she'd used as a teenager to sneak out to the woods. The truck bounced violently, the suspension screaming, but the heavy tires gripped to the red clay. The sedan, built for speed and city streets, tried to follow. Its driver realized too late that the road was nothing more than a ditch hidden by tall grass. The heavy car hit a hidden stump, flipped once, and slid into a deep, muddy ravine with a sound like a giant crushing a soda can. Ruth stopped the truck. She grabbed a heavy wrench from the floorboard and walked toward the wreckage. Smoke curled from the crumpled hood. The driver was slumped over the airbag, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. She pulled the door open, the metal groaning in protest, and dragged him out. She recognized him instantly. It was Miller, the former sheriff who'd been run out of town 5 years ago for taking bribes from the poultry plant. Now he was wearing a tactical vest with a corporate logo. "Miller," she said, her voice a low growl. "Who's paying you?" He groaned, his eyes fluttering. "You're dead, Ruth. You and that old man. You don't know what you're sitting on." She left him there. She didn't have time for a confession she already understood. She drove back to a small, secluded cabin her father had built in the woods, a place the city didn't have on their tax maps. She spread the map out on the wooden table, using a magnifying glass she kept in the glove box. She ignored the Heritage Walk labels. She looked at the technical specs of the underground vaults. Zone 4, hazardous containment. Zone 7, filtration and processing. The realization hit her like an icy wave. This wasn't a mall. It wasn't a tribute to the town's history. The Heritage Walk was a front for a regional toxic waste processing hub. The luxury facades were just a shell to hide the vats of chemicals that would be shipped in by rail from the industrial plants in Atlanta. They weren't modernizing Monticello. They were turning it into a graveyard for the state's poison. And they were doing it because the land was cheap and the people were supposedly too tired to fight back. And her nephew, her Daniel, had been the one to help them bury the lead. The next day was Founders' Day. The town square was a sea of red, white, and blue. The smell of barbecue smoke filled the air, a cruel parody of a celebration. Ruth stood on the edge of the square, watching as the mayor shook hands and kissed babies. Her diner sat behind a wall of yellow police tape, a ghost of its former self. She felt like an outcast in her own home. People she'd known for 40 years, people whose kids she'd fed and whose secrets she'd kept, turned their heads when she walked by. The mayor's smear campaign had been effective. They didn't see a woman fighting for her home. They saw a delusional saboteur who was trying to stop the town's only hope for economic survival. Silas found her behind the bandstand, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked older, smaller, as if the weight of the secret was crushing his bones. "I got them, Ruth," he whispered, patting a leather satchel. "The mayor's brother. He's the treasurer for the shell company. These are his personal ledgers. It shows the kickbacks. It shows the offshore accounts. We need to get to the sheriff's substation," Ruth said, reaching for the bag. "If we can get this on the record before the keynote speech." The music from the bandstand swelled, a loud, brassy march that drowned out everything else. From the shadows of the festival tents, 2 men emerged. Not Miller's thugs this time, but men in suits. Professional security. The struggle was short and brutal. A heavy baton caught Ruth across the temple, and the world dissolved into a blur of gray and red. She hit the ground, the taste of dirt filling her mouth. Through a haze of pain, she saw them grab Silas. They didn't care about her anymore. They threw him into a plain white van, his thin legs kicking feebly before the doors slammed shut. "Silas!" She tried to scream, but her voice was a dry croak. The van sped away, disappearing into the festival traffic. Ruth crawled toward the leather satchel they'd dropped in the dirt. Her head throbbed, a rhythmic pounding that matched the beat of the drums on stage. She clutched the ledgers to her chest and staggered toward the substation, her vision swimming. The acting sheriff, a man named Henderson, who'd always been a little too friendly with the mayor, took the ledgers with a practiced frown. He flipped through the pages, his expression shifting from curiosity to a cold, hard amusement. "Ruth, Ruth, Ruth," he said, tossing the books onto his desk. "Did you really think it would be this easy? These are forgeries, obvious ones. Look at the dates. Look at the signatures." "They aren't forgeries, Henderson. Silas took them from the office. Silas is a confused old man who's probably halfway to Florida by now," Henderson said, standing up. He walked around the desk, the handcuffs on his belt jingling. "These files were designed to look like industrial espionage. You're being charged with planting fake evidence, defamation, and trespassing on city property." Ruth felt the cold steel of the cuffs snap around her wrists. The trap had closed. She wasn't just losing her diner. She was going to prison. They marched her out into the center of the town square, right past the bandstand where the mayor was beginning his speech. The crowd went silent as they saw her. Ruth Callahan, the heart of the town, in handcuffs. "It's a tragedy," Mayor Vance said into the microphone, his voice dripping with practiced pity. "To see a pillar of our community succumb to such a mental decline. We tried to help her. We offered her a fair price. But the mind is a fragile thing." Ruth looked up at him, her eyes burning with a cold, clear fury. She looked past him at the librarian, a woman who had always been the quiet shadow in every town meeting. The librarian was smiling, a small, satisfied curve of the lips that didn't reach her eyes. Ruth realized then that the mayor wasn't the mastermind. He was a puppet, sweating through his expensive suit. The librarian, with her knowledge of every deed, every debt, and every secret in Monticello, was the one pulling the strings. Henderson's grip on her arm loosened for a split second as a group of rowdy teenagers set off a string of firecrackers near the barbecue pits. It was the only opening she needed. Ruth dropped her weight, drove her elbow into Henderson's stomach, and vanished into the crowd. She didn't run for the woods. She ran for the diner. She knew the building's secrets better than any architect. She climbed the rusted ladder in the alley and squeezed her way into the grease vents, the narrow metal shafts slick with decades of residue. It was a suffocating, claustrophobic crawl, the heat of the Georgia sun turning the ducts into an oven. Her lungs burned and her skin was raw, but she pushed forward. She dropped into the kitchen, the checkered floor silent beneath her boots. She didn't turn on the lights. She went straight to the back corner, near the walk-in cooler, and pried up the loose floorboard. The safe was there, a heavy iron box her grandfather had installed when the banks failed in the 30s. She spun the dial, 14, 28, 52 WEC, the years of her family's births. The heavy door groaned open. She didn't look for money. She pulled out the original 1920s land deed. It was a yellowed, fragile document, but the ink was clear. She scanned the fine print at the bottom, her finger trembling as she found the public trust clause. This land is granted in perpetuity for the purpose of community nourishment and shall not be repurposed for private industrial use or hazardous utility without a unanimous vote of the resident population. The developers had missed it. They'd looked at the modern tax maps, the digital records the librarian had likely doctored. They hadn't looked at the original paper, but there was more. Tucked behind the deed was a stack of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. She recognized the handwriting. It was the librarian's husband, a man who had died 20 years ago under mysterious circumstances. The letters weren't love notes. They were a detailed record of the librarian's shell company, her offshore accounts, and the evidence she was using to blackmail Mayor Vance into facilitating the toxic waste hub. Ruth stood up, the documents clutched in her hand. The silence of the diner was heavy with the ghosts of the past. But for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. She didn't sneak back out. She walked out the front door, tearing the police tape away with a single, violent motion. The mayor was mid-sentence when she reached the stage. And so, as we look to the future of Heritage Walk, the future is a lie, Arthur. Ruth's voice rang out, amplified by the sheer force of her will. She climbed the steps, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. Henderson tried to stop her, but the townspeople, her regulars, the ones who had seen her in cuffs and felt a twinge of doubt, blocked his path. "Look at this," she shouted, holding up the 1920s deed. "This land can't be sold for your poison, and look at these." She threw the letters at the librarian, who had turned a ghastly shade of gray. "Your shell company, your blackmail. You're selling our children's health for a kickback." The silence that followed was absolute. Then a murmur began, a low rumbling sound that grew into a roar of righteous fury. The townspeople looked at the map she'd pinned to the podium, the red-inked toxic zones finally visible to everyone. The developer's security team saw the shift in the wind. They didn't wait for the police. They vanished into the crowd, leaving the mayor and the librarian to face the mob alone. By sunset, the resignation had been signed on the very stage where the lies had been told. The eviction was stayed, The Heritage Walk project was dead, and the police were finally doing their jobs, escorting the librarian and the mayor toward the county jail. Ruth sat alone in her diner that night. The bell above the door was silent. The checkered floor was covered in dust and broken glass. She had her land. She had her diner. But as she looked at the empty booths, she realized that the Monticello she loved was gone. The trust was broken. The friendships were fractured. And Daniel was gone, vanished into the night before she could even look him in the eye. She picked up her bristle brush and a bucket of clean water. There was still a smear of something dark on the sidewalk, and she had a lot of work to do before the morning rush. But as she scrubbed, she knew that some stains, the ones on the soul of a town, never truly come out.